Well, tonight we're going to be taking a look at chapter 9 of The Good and Beautiful Life, How to Live Without Avarice. And the big idea that Smythe shares inside of the chapter this week is that we are all stewards of the money that we earn or the money that we're given, and we can choose to invest what we've been given either in earthly or in heavenly treasures. Now, avarice, which is a word that I was not overly familiar with when I was opening the book, it's not one you hear every day, is a word that's defined as talking about having a greed, but not just greed for anything, it's a greed for wealth and material gain. Now, here's the thing about us as humans. As humans, I tend to find that we are the collectors of things. We like gathering things, accumulating things, collecting, holding on to things. And in the Western world where we live, we've almost turned gathering possessions into a professional sport. We have so much stuff in the West that we struggle to find space for it in our homes, and we're cluttering and filling the attics. We put the shed outside. We stuff stuff out there. We even find places to go and rent just so we can put the stuff that we can't manage to fit in our homes that we can't use at this time. And even those of us who don't have that amount of money or that amount of stuff to be renting larger storage spaces to put it into, we can still be gripped by the desire to accumulate. And behind this is a story we tell ourselves, and this is what we talk about in The Good and Beautiful Life and The Good and Beautiful God. We talk about how the stories we tell ourselves shape our lives, and underneath this story, this desire for things, is a story that if I have more, or if I have a little more money, or if I have these particular items, then either I will feel more secure or powerful. If I have more money, if I only had $1 million, I would feel secure or I'd feel powerful. If I only had this fancy car or this item or this game, then I'd feel like I'm successful or I'd feel like I'm happy. And that's what drives us to go after things. It's this story, the sense that if I just had a bit more, then I would feel a bit better, because that's going to be what feeds my happiness. Now, here's the thing. When we say it as starkly as that, we kind of know that that's not true, but these stories, this story about the desire for more, is really something that gets embedded in us in different ways in our lives. And all of us have stories that feed into this sense of lack or sense of need. In my life, when I look back at my life, I think about what happened to my family. When I was about 6, my father was in an industrial accident at work, which caused him a great injury. He had tremendous back problems, caused issues with him being able to find employment and struggling to feel like he was able to get ahead. Now, and that just meant in my household growing up that money was tight. Now, I never went without. My parents were great, and they provided, and I cherish and love my childhood. But I tell you the story about my dad for this reason. Knowing that he struggled with work and some of those things at points, and finances were tight, I remember my father lamenting to me about how he wished that he was going to be able to do more for my brother, my sister, and I. I remember him saying, you know what, I just loved sailing when I was a young man. Sailing was something I loved to do. And he said, I just wish we lived not far from the St. John River. We could see it from our home. I wish I had the money that I could get a boat and teach you boys to sail. Or I just wish I had the ability to buy these tools, to have a workshop, to teach you how to do woodworking, which is something he really loved. And I remember those laments and the way that put great value on the importance of financial security, even influencing what careers and thought patterns I considered before eventually following God's call into pastoral ministry. Now, I tell you my story just to say that we all have stories like this that shape how we understand what it is to have and what it isn't. Stories of desire, stories of items that we sought after. I remember how much I really desired to get my hands on the latest Nintendo game or Nintendo system and used my money from my paper route to do so. See, here's the thing, though, and I just want to kind of put this out there, that avarice, that desire for possessions or that desire for material wealth is something that's never satisfied. I would say it like this. I'd explain it like an appetite. And here's the truth about appetites. You do not satisfy an appetite by feeding it, because the appetite you feed only gets stronger. For example, cheesecake. If you say, oh, I really wish I had a piece of cheesecake, I'm going to tell you something. If you have one piece of really good cheesecake from the Cheesecake Factory, that's not going to make you feel like you never want cheesecake again. In fact, you'll desire cheesecake more again later because you fed that appetite. You fed that appetite. The appetites we feed get stronger. They don't go away. But that said, there's a partial truth. There's a partial truth that money and possessions do provide us happiness, and they do for a moment. And that can be a powerful experience. In fact, I think about something that I really wanted for a number of years. I remember watching Steve Jobs when he did his first announcement about what an iPhone was going to be. I remember watching that. And, just when Heidi and I were first married, we had other priorities. We were a young family, and we had things. And she knew I wanted an iPhone, but it wasn't really something realistic. In fact, one year, the year before I got my first iPhone, she made me a birthday cake in the shape of an iPhone, which was actually my first iPhone. It was really kind of cute. But then the following year, we managed to pick up a secondhand iPhone. In fact, this is the first iPhone I ever owned here. And I remember being so excited. It was able to, do iMessage, and I could look at the internet on it, and I could have all my contacts easily accessible because I had an old flip phone before that and a cheap smartphone that was really kind of dumb before that. So I could actually have all my contacts for work on my phone and know who was texting or calling or be able to call someone whenever I went somewhere. And it was so exciting. But now, so many years later, if you want to find my first iPhone, it's got a piece of tape on it because the screen's cracked and it's in a drawer with a bunch of other storage old documents in my dresser upstairs. There's something exciting about get something new, and we enjoy that. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the things we have, but here's the thing. Eventually, even the most exciting possession or item will decay or just turn into a tool, or the novelty will wear off. Now I've got a newer iPhone. I got one last year. I'd held on to the other one for 5 years before that. But as exciting as I was for that, and I enjoy this still, after a certain period of time, it just turns into another thing. Here's the thing. True happiness and true security comes from living life in God's kingdom. Knowing that we live in the realm where our Father never leaves us alone and never forsakes us. When Jesus talks about economics and dealing with this issue of avarice, he tells 3 stories, and they're all covered inside of the chapter this week. He uses 3 metaphors that he wants us to look at. And I want to read the passages and talk a little bit about each one of those today. The first one is Matthew 6:19-21. It's the first of the stories. And Jesus says this, he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Back years ago when I was helping work in youth ministry, I remember we went to Catons Island Camp and we had a guest speaker by the name of Brian Metzger. He came from PEI. He was a great communicator, and he spoke from this passage one day and used an illustration that has stuck with me. It must be good because 20 years ago, I still remember it today. He talked about how he wished that he could go around with one of those little price tag label makers, just a label maker, where he could go around and start labeling things. And he said, I would love to go around this island, or I'd love to go around your neighborhood, and I'd like to go around with 2 label makers in hand, one that says temporary and one that says eternal. One that says temporary, this table, temporary. This cup, temporary. This iPhone, temporary. That person, eternal. Eternally valuable. This building, temporary. These lights, temporary. The TV screen or computer you're looking on, temporary. This body, this physical form, is temporary. It's going to have to be transformed before it gets to be eternal. But the person who is embodied here, you, the people you meet every day, eternal. See, here's the thing. Jesus tells us that we have the opportunity to make our treasure what is eternal. And what is eternal? God's kingdom, God's values, the kingdom of Christ, following and serving Jesus, loving the people he puts in our path. That's eternal. And where we make our treasure, there our heart will be also. If we say, God, I'm going to say this is my treasure, then that transforms the desires of our heart. If we say, God, what you value, your kingdom, which is about reconciling this world to yourself and establishing your values in this world by service and love and compassion and forgiveness and submitting to the ways of the Spirit in the power of Christ, that's eternal. If we make that our treasure, then that chases where our heart's going to go. Now, it's not just a matter of saying, okay, can I accumulate enough righteousness points with God to get a bigger TV in my heavenly home? But it's about learning to value what God values. Will we put our value in our children or our parents or the people God has given us to care for, the poor, our neighbor, our brother and sister in Christ? Let's be careful that we remember to put extreme value on the things God values, and not just on things that are going to be fleeting. The second illustration Jesus uses in Matthew chapter 6, verses 22 and 23. It says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. Then if the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? See, and Smythe goes on to talk about how the metaphor and understanding of what's there is that generosity, being stingy and jealous. You think about the old expression about the evil eye, the eye of jealousy, the eye of covetousness. Pastor Werner was speaking just recently about thou shalt not covet, or you shall not covet your neighbor's goods from the 10 Commandments. And he talked about how that desire and covetousness is a corroding influence that violates all the other commandments. You cannot live in freedom when you're living in covetousness and desiring and yearning, because those things that we yearn after, that we long to grasp and make our own, they will fill our life with darkness because they'll consume us. They'll become idols. But if our eye is full of light, and the illustration here is that if we have generosity, if we're pouring out and graciously giving and seeking after the good of others, and seeking not to just pull things into ourselves, but to give, that's where light happens. That's a kingdom value. That's a value that, even secular people or people who are not followers of Jesus could appreciate. And so, you know what? A generous person is a person tends to be happier. In fact, I've read articles by social scientists talking about the value of generosity. But as confident people in the kingdom, it's not just about saying, if I learn to be generous, I'll learn to be happier. The reality is, if we are in God's kingdom, if we understand that we are his children and embraced by him, we start from a place of confidence knowing that God will provide and care for us, that we are never in trouble. The kingdom is never in trouble. So we're able to be generous and all the freer. And as a consequence, knowing that God will care for us, we can experience the joy of that generosity, not just out of a desire to manipulate our psyche, but out of knowing that we're founded under the value of God's kingdom and standing on his provision. Our supply to be generous will never run dry. And then finally, Matthew 6, verse 24 says, no one can serve two masters, for either he'll hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Now, mammon's not a word that we use every day in the English language. Some other translations will translate it money. You can't serve both God and money, or you can't serve both God and wealth. But here's the general principle. Mammon, or just that idea of wealth and the desire for it, you can't, how would I put it? Mammon or wealth makes a great servant but a horrible master. Wealth pretends, and here's the thing, wealth pretends to offer us what only truly comes from God: security, comfort, and happiness. The more we serve money, even if we accumulate more, we don't find security in it. God is the source of ultimate peace. Wealth will not make you feel secure. Some of the wealthiest people in the world are people who still struggle with insecurity. Look, if we want to experience the peace that God offers us, we want to serve him. Because here's the thing. In the same way that wealth makes a horrible master, but a good servant, God is a great master, but we can never imagine that we can make him our servant. It's kind of what takes me to what we think about kingdom economics. You see, the truth of the kingdom of God is that we can trust in God to provide for me and my family. And when I am confident that God is going to care for me, then I'm free to seek his kingdom. I'm free to invest in what he values. I'm free to look at what he's up to in this world and say, I want to get in on that. And here's a principle I want to give to you, and I've seen it borne out in my life, the life of my family, and the life of believers I respect and cherish and have known, is that when we are generous with what God gives us, he provides and is generous back to us. I've heard it said this way, you can't outgive God. And I found it to be so true. As I've tried to be generous and in my own life, tried to be generous with the thing God cares about and even pour my finances into what I believe God would call me to pour my finances into, I found that God has poured back blessing upon my family and upon me. But here's the thing I want to say. There are those who would almost turn this into a magic formula. And I think that's where we get in danger of almost thinking that we can manipulate God and turn him into our servant. And that's not even Christian. That's not Christian at all. Some people would say, you know what, if you give $1,000, I can guarantee that God's going to give you $10,000 back. You know what? That's dangerous thinking. That's manipulative thinking. That's what I would call even sorcery. If you say that if I do this, then God must behave in this way back to me, you're no different than somebody who's trying to shake some magic charms and make the weather change. We cannot manipulate God. But there are kingdom principles at play in this world. Here's the kingdom principle, is if I'm a good steward of what God provides to me, God will see to it that I have opportunity to steward other things. And while that might not always pan out in ways that are tangible in terms of money and things, you know what? You have struggled to measure this, but I'm just going to tell you, if you talk to people who've lived it, it's true. And even when things don't pan out in this world, I trust that God has treasures and stewardship that await us as we go into the next world, continuing in his kingdom. But here's the thing. The goal we want to think about today is simplicity. Simplicity. In the world, especially in this part of the world that is, in bondage and entrapped with materialism and consumption, we would do well to learn the secret of contentment. You know what? We can enjoy what God provides. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the blessings that God has given to us. But here's the question we have to ask. Am I in bondage to my possessions, or am I free to enjoy them? There's sometimes that we get in this place where, and maybe this is the case with you, when you look at your basement, or you look in your closet, or you look in the storage shed that you've had to rent down there. Why is it that is it possible that you're in bondage to those things? If you're not able to give some of them away, or sell them and maybe even give some of the proceeds to things that God would care about. If you say, oh no, I can't get rid of that. Why can't you get rid of that? Why is it that you feel you must have more, maybe so much more wealth, or so much more in terms of possessions and items? See, if we get to the point that we cannot give something up, or we cannot let it go, then we have to ask why it is we cannot. And we have to be careful, because when we start talking like this about how much is too much, then we start getting into this realm where we can start getting very legalistic and judgmental when we think about this. So we've got to begin by watching our own hearts. But we need to be careful that, one, we don't get judgmental of what other people have, or get legalistic in even our own thinking. We need to be thankful for what God gives and enjoy it. But remember, God provides these things to us to be generous so that we can give out of what he's given to us to others. So here's what I just want to encourage you with. God has got a purpose that is so great for you that he does not want you to become shackled to your possessions, shackled to avarice, shackled to the desire for more. But we don't get free of that just by trying to make ourselves get rid of things on their own. We have to change the story we remind ourselves in our hearts. And here's the story that Jesus would tell you. God is your heavenly Father who will provide for your needs. You are not alone, and you do not need to depend on accumulating for your own peace and your own happiness. And when we begin to realize that we walk and live in the security of God our Father, then we do not need to look to other things to provide us the joy, peace, security, or sense of power that we need. Now, before we go, I want to talk a little bit about the coming week's spiritual practice. And the practice for the coming week is prayer. But not just prayer in general, specifically prayer as it relates to the chapter we're reading, which is going to be prayer as we think about worry. See, here's the thing. We're going to talk next week about how to live without worry. And the idea as you go into prayer for next week's spiritual practice is to take a few moments at the start of each day, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and list down the things that are causing you worry or things that you're concerned about. And then as you take that moment in prayer, say, okay, what are the things that I can take action on? And there might be some things you can do about those items you worry about. But then there's some things that are just beyond your control. And here's what we want to do when we look at those issues that we're worrying about that are beyond our control. We want to take time in prayer to commit those to God and leave those in His hands. And that's a practice we want to do each day this week. And as you read the chapter, How to Live Without Worry, chapter 10, we're just trusting that as you pray and you reflect on that, that maybe God will help you to be free from the bondage of worry. So that's what's coming up for next week. Next week, you want to read chapter 10, Learning to Live Without Worry, and then also to do the spiritual practice of prayer. And you'll find guidance on pages 183 and 184 to help you out with that. God bless. We look forward to seeing you next time.